Well, hello and welcome to our talk about the Carlton in Lindrick Prophetess. For those of you who don't know, Carlton in Lindrick is a small village just outside Worksop in North Nottinghamshire, and we're going to investigate some extraordinary things that happened there in the early 1600s, a time of political and religious ferment. So the story of the Carlton Prophetess really takes us back to about 1640. So let's consider what life was like at that time. It was a time when the country was divided by bitter disputes, particularly between the king and his bishops on one hand and the Puritans of Parliament on another hand. As a result, no one trusted those in power. Lines of division were really quite severe at that time. On top of that, people were worried about the future. There were really quite terrible forecasts of what was going to happen to the economy. Other people were joining in and saying that the crops were going to fail, as well as evidence that the climate was changing in some parts of the country, and that was affecting farming as well. Taxes were a big issue. Charles had imposed ship money on people, and lots of the gentry, particularly in Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire, actually went to prison for refusing to pay Charles's new tax. And on top of that, a really strong religious fervour that was starting to emerge, in the middle of which some people were starting to make dire predictions about the future and whether the world was going to come to an end. So you might have concluded from my last slide that life in 1641 was not a lot different to how it is today. But perhaps one of the biggest differences was that there was a king who actually was trying to exert power over the country. So Charles I is sort of in a way one of the central figures of the story. And in 1641 things had got into a bit of a crisis. He was in conflict with Parliament, both because he was different in terms of his emerging religious views and because he was trying to impose a taxation system which they did not like. Particularly the Puritans in Parliament opposed him on both measures. Now he tried to make some major concessions, but Parliament was trying to reduce his power, and eventually something was going to crack. Eventually Charles fled to Scotland, hoping for greater support. And just to show really how central religion was to this dispute, we've got the controversial figure of William Laud, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was imprisoned in Tower of London, largely on the say-so of the Puritan opposition to the king. And he went into the Tower, and at the same time they let out pretty well his old enemy Bishop John Williams, who was the Bishop of Lincoln, although he actually went back into the Tower again later on. And William Laud, of course, was famously executed, and we've got this marvellous window from Boston Stump showing William Laud posing with his axe, a curious way of portraying the history of the time, you might think. So now we get into the real situation of the Carlton Prophetess and who she was and what she had to say. And you'll immediately have some ideas of your own about what a prophet or a prophetess might be like. And in the 1640s, even to claim to speak the word of God would have been quite controversial with the Puritans, whose main emphasis pretty well always was on the Bible as the one true voice of God. So being a prophet at all was controversial. But it was also a time of millennialism, and this was the great focus on is the world coming to an end? Is Jesus going to return? A lot of pressure on that type of thing. So into this time of great stress, we learn about the story of the Carlton Prophetess. And it really begins in 1641, when, according to the printed record, and we'll discuss how controversial or not that is in a minute, according to the record, Margaret Holbeck of Blythe got married to James Turner at Carlton near Worksop, or Worsop as it's actually printed in the document. And all we're told about them really is that James Turner was the beloved servant of a man called Sir Francis Thorney, and Thorney was so fond of his servant that he arranged for the wedding feast to be held at his own house. Now, as I just said, the only reason we really know about this story at all is because it was printed in a pamphlet at the time. And here we've got the original copy of the pamphlet. You can see it's called The Wonderful Works of God Declared by a Strange Prophecy of a Maid that lately lived near Worsop. And this is really the only source of information that we've got. And as we've just said, it begins with this wedding of James Turner, a man beloved of Sir Francis Thorney and apparently beloved of the whole of the inhabitants of the district as well. Now, having told us about the wedding, the pamphlet then gets really into the main story that it's interested in, and it starts really just after the wedding, when James Turner's sister and her friend, of whom we're told that she's the daughter of Simon Franklin of Worksop, went back to Sir Francis Thorney's house and visited a person that they call Mrs. Anne. And the pamphlet describes her as the daughter of Sir Francis Thorney. That might mean daughter, it might mean daughter-in-law. And what they seem to have done then is spend some time indulging in a little bit of fun about nice clothes. And the maid, that's the sister of Turner, she talks about how her brother used to give her money for nice dresses, but now he's married, she might miss out on those sorts of things. Whereas Miss Franklin, her friend, she spends her time boasting about the wonderful clothes that her mother and others have been able to buy for her. So I've got some quite interesting contrasting attitudes in this afternoon at the house. Now, the printed document spends quite a bit of time talking about this very pleasant afternoon that the three young ladies have together at Sir Francis Thorney's house. And it makes clear that they're eating up a lot of leftover from the wedding. The wedding cake is being eaten, wine is being drunk. And then as things go on, Miss Anne, or Mrs. Anne, the daughter of Sir Francis, began to get out all her best clothes and dresses to show to the other young ladies, saying that her father had given them. And Miss Franklin is described as particularly enthusiastic about this occasion. Now, the book pauses to comment that God is a jealous God and hates pride. And it's quite clearly that these young ladies are proud about these rich clothes, which they haven't done anything themselves to earn. So we can see moral retribution is coming around the corner, and you might wonder, who do you think is going to be the first to die? Well, very dramatically, the next afternoon, both Miss Turner and Mrs. Anne Thorney dropped dead the same afternoon. Interestingly, not Miss Franklin, who perhaps was the one who most showed pride during the previous day's activity. The two young women dropped dead so quickly that poison was suspected, although we never really hear much more about this in the printed pamphlet. At that point, Parson Faber, who seems to be the local vicar, suggested that the two young women should be buried in one grave, rather an odd idea given that one of them is one of the gentry, and Sir Francis duly rejected that idea, but it's really Miss Turner that we're interested in anyway. And so you can imagine Miss Turner's mother taking one long last look at her young daughter, perhaps wrapped up in her funeral shroud, at which point the girl, to her mother's complete shock, suddenly sat up with a cheerful countenance and began to speak. Well, what do you think she was going to say? Well, these are her exact words, according to the pamphlet. "My most dear mother, why have you sinned so sore against God? You have made me sorrowful many times. But be you content. God hath forgiven all. For I am sent as a messenger unto you, and within 5 days I shall return again to the place I came from." So there's an interesting few words. Now, the young lady began to give quite a detailed description of what had happened to her in the time between dying and then suddenly waking up again. And she describes in the pamphlet how she went on a journey through a forest and met an old man by a brook. Quite an interesting word to use, because it's not a word that a North Nottinghamshire person might have used at the time. They would have preferred beck. Anyway, she met the old man and he took her to what she describes as a costly fort. It turns out to be more of a palace than a fort, I think you might find. And this palace is full of angels, and they're singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of the Sabbath." Again, an interesting choice of term. Clearly this is meant to be heaven. But after a while, the old man tells her that it is not the intention for her to stay there, but that she needs to return to her family to deliver a message from God. The young lady's not very keen on this idea. She rather likes it where she is. And so a bit of negotiation, and they agree that she will go back to her former life for 5 days, after which she can return. Now, in her returned self, some things are the same, some things are different. She eats normally. This is made quite clear. They feed her with meat and she eats happily. And they also notice, and this is commented on several times, that she's much more jolly than normal. She seems to have normally been a bit of a sad character, but now she's happy and laughing much more than normal, and happily engages in conversation with Parson Faber, who, not surprisingly perhaps, has come to have a chat with her. So now we get into the detail of what our prophet is going to prophesy, and really it's pretty traditional stuff. England is going to be judged for its sin of pride. There's going to be a period of desolation, worry, war and sorrow. There are signs and visions for the world to come to an end that we need to look out for. And then on this slide we've given you a little bit more detail of the sort of character of what she said. And it talks about countries being destroyed, men being chased out of their houses and murdered. But very interestingly, in the middle of this, then God will take his own that have turned unto him. So we're seeing a millennialist streak in this prophecy. So God will take his own, others will be left to feel the wrath of God, but after a while things will become more peaceful. But even in that time of peace, the sort of luxurious enjoyment of fine clothes and that sort of thing will be considered loathsome to God. So there's a clear link being made between the prophecy and what the 3 girls were doing in the day before the fateful afternoon. But of course the 5 days were soon up. And then we get a detailed description of how the girl's life came to an end for the second time. She requested that Mr. Faber would come round to her house so that they could take communion together. She insisted that this had to be by the rites of the Church of England and denounced the Catholic Church and all its machinations. Mr. Faber took communion with her. Then she asked them all to say the Lord's Prayer with her and gently fell asleep and died. So a good godly death, you might say, although unusually this was the second one she'd apparently experienced. So that's a quick summary of the career of the prophetess as told in this pamphlet, and we can ask ourselves, is it true? Well, some of you will probably be thinking it's all made up, and others of you might be thinking, well, it could be true. Well, not surprisingly, the first Victorian historians of Worksop dismissed it all as utter nonsense. And they did that because they asked the vicar at Carlton in Lindrick to check for marriage records. He couldn't find any that matched up, and therefore they concluded it was untrue. There was nobody called Sir Francis Thorney, or was there? And actually, when we look into the North Nottinghamshire gentry, we do find that there was somebody who might fit the bill. And there was the family of Sir Francis Thorney had lived in the area for a long time. If we look down their family tree here, you'll even see that there's a couple of them are spelt Thorney, as the name was spelt in the original booklet. In fact, they were quite important people in the area. One of them was MP for East Retford, had been knighted by King James, and indeed another one of the family became a very important figure in the Civil War. So they're a potential family of interest. So here's a little bit more detail on that family. It's worth noting that Sir Francis did exist as a real person, and indeed he owned land at Osberton, which is just a couple of miles really from Carlton in Lindrick, so very definitely in the right area. He actually died a couple of years after these events and was buried at Sturton-le-Steeple, and his famous son, who was Colonel Sir Francis, he died in 1648 after being involved in the Battle of Preston, and he's also buried at Sturton-le-Steeple. So these are well-known people in the area who certainly people around Worksop would have known their names very well. In fact, the younger Sir Francis was quite a famous character. He was educated in Lincoln. He was a friend of the famous Colonel John Hutchinson, who's well known because of the Nottingham Castle diary of his wife Lucy. He lived in Nottinghamshire a lot of his life. He was wounded in battles in Gainsborough and Newark, again quite local, before dying at Preston in 1648. And he was a well-known and successful soldier, famous as a striking figure with his tawny yellow hair and beard. So quite a celebrity in the local area. But it's quite clear, and perhaps part of the story, that this family were very distinctly on the Puritan side. And in fact, Lucy Hutchinson wrote about him in quite a lot of detail in her diary. He was well known to her as one of the best friends of her husband. But we need to remember, of course, that at this point the younger Sir Francis' fame was still in the future. In 1641, the best known local figure would have been his father, the old Sir Francis. But it clearly shows us which side of the fence this family was on at a time of division nationally. And of course it's the timing of the Carlton prophecies that is really very, very interesting, because she predicted disaster, war and bloodshed, and that is exactly what happened. Really only the next year afterwards, the Civil War broke out in 1642, lasted 3 or 4 years, and then broke out again later on. So she really did predict, in that sense, what happened. Proportionately, the numbers of the population who died in the Civil War were much greater than in World War I or World War II. So it was a catastrophic event. She also predicted, as we saw, that men would be chased from their homes, and that's exactly what happened to Colonel Hutchinson, for example. His house was destroyed by royalists. And we've also noted how her words had a millenarian emphasis. And over the course of the 1640s and 1650s, the millenarian view gathered ground that the godly would be taken to the Lord in advance of others. And this became an increasingly popular interpretation of Scripture. Now, before we get too excited about all this, we need to just take a step back with perhaps the Victorian skeptics and consider, well, what about some of the details? And there are a few details of this which are problematic. For example, I cannot find any record of Mr. Faber. Neither have I been able to find any record of the young couple or their marriage. Another mystery is Simon Franklin of Worksop, who was clearly named, and Mrs. Anne, who was she? Now, there's not really any clear evidence that there was an Anne Thorney locally, but there was one in London. And so we can always start to chip away at some of these pieces of evidence. For example, perhaps Mr. Faber was a curate rather than the actual vicar or rector, in which case his place in the records would not have been so considerable. Now, a couple of other factors we might want to put into the equation is that by the 1640s, the Church of England authorities had lost control of publishing. So it had become much easier to produce this type of work, which actually was openly critical of the Romanizing tendencies of the church leaders. It was also a time when increasingly Puritans were engaging with a debate over whether there could be direct revelation outside of the Bible. And of course, this in itself was a challenge to the authorities of the church, but also to the reformed tradition of belief that the Puritans might generally held. So we have several possibilities here, and one of those might be that the story was published by people who knew the details but actually perhaps changed some of the names. Who can say at this stage? So I'm going to leave you to make your own mind up and put before you the possible options that you can consider. The first thing perhaps is the simplest and most obvious one. The whole thing is fiction. It's made up for some purpose that is not entirely clear to us. Second possibility is that maybe it's an allegorical work. It's not actually true in the sense of factually true, but it's been written to make some points about the lifestyle of people at the time. And by including a reference which could be identified as a local family, try to gain some sort of support, maybe from that family or their friends in the area. And the third possibility, which you might want to consider, is that actually it's substantially true, but that some errors were made in names, or maybe some names were changed deliberately to spoil the blushes of some of those involved in the story. Well, I leave it to you to decide, and if you really want to know more, you can find it on the internet and read the whole thing for yourself. Now, if you've enjoyed this talk and would like to know more about the history of Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, or particularly the history of the Christian faith in this region, we have several books of possible interest to you. There's The Restless Soul's Pilgrim Roots, which tells the turbulent history of Christianity across Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire up to 1660. And we have From Here We Change the World, which is a guidebook to all the important places in North Notts and West Links which are connected to the development of the Christian faith, including the Pilgrim Fathers, Wesley and many more. And we also have a book called People and Places of North Notts and Bassetlaw, which is a guide to all the interesting places in the area and some of the strange, bizarre or even heroic people who lived in those places. And like all our books, you can get these from Bookworm Retford. Phone number is on the slide here, or you can get them from your usual online retailers as well. And finally, we also do history tours. So if you've got a family group or a local history society or a church group, you can talk to us at Pilgrims and Prophets Christian Heritage Tours about an interesting day out that we can provide for you.